Я впервые услышала имя Шанталь Муф от своего коллеги и друга Владимира Фурса. И я считаю необходимым назвать сегодня это имя, потому что, насколько мне известно, Владимир Фурс был первым белорусским философом, который анализировал, интерпретировал наследие Шанталь Муф, публиковал работы, посвященные, в которых анализировал ее теоретические подходы, и показывал, каким образом некоторые из этих теоретических новаций могут быть использованы для анализа проблем белорусского общества. Относительно недавно было 10 лет с момента, времени ухода Владимира Фурса из жизни, и в некотором смысле сегодняшняя лекция, сегодняшняя дискуссия дань памяти нашему коллеге. Эта встреча стала возможна в том числе благодаря поддержке, помощи ряда партнерских организаций. Я тоже хочу их назвать. Это Летучий университет, Международная ассоциация гуманитариев, книгарня Логвинов. Огромное всем спасибо, всем коллегам, друзьям, которые поддержали эту идею и сегодня носят вклад в то, чтобы все это как-то держалось и работало. И отдельно, конечно, я хочу назвать имя Оксаны Белявской. Это наша синхронная переводчица, которая сидит вот в той кабинке, мы ее видим, она с нами. И благодаря ей сегодня наша дискуссия, я надеюсь, вообще вся эта встреча будет проходить таким образом, что взаимопонимание будет достигнуто даже в тех случаях, если какие-то есть сложности с английским языком. Окей. Now I shift to English, and I'd like to introduce our honorable guest, Chantal Mouffe. Chantal Mouffe studied philosophy at the University of Leuven. Then she went to Paris, where she worked with Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser. At the end of 1966, Chantal Mouffe left for Columbia, where she taught philosophy at the National University of Columbia in Bogota. After that, she decided to come back to Europe to study politics at the University of Essex. She worked at the biggest university in the United States, Harvard, Berkeley, Princeton, and in France, in particular in Collège International de Philosophie in Paris. In 1995, Chantal Mouffe became a professor of political theory at the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster in London, where she remains as an emeritus professor since 2008. Chantal Mouffe is author and editor of numerous widely known scholarly books. Let me mention a few of them. First of all, of course, it's a famous book, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy Towards a Radical Democratic Politics. This book was written in co-authorship with Argentinian political theorist Ernesto Laclau and published in 1985. Then, The Democratic Paradox, book published in 2000, and the next book, On the Political, 2005, and just recently published book, Foreign Left Populism, published in 2008. In her works, Chantal Mouffe develops post-Marxist political theory, which is aimed at providing a framework to envisage a new form of politics. She calls this new form of politics radical democracy or agonistic democracy. Chantal Mouffe is a thinker who passionately strives to elaborate conditions of possibility of a vivid social political alternative to the neoliberal order. In this regard, responding to the recent rise of right-wing populism in Europe, she argues that simple dismissal of populism is a short-sighted reaction and advocates a left populism. Her rehabilitation of a populist aspect in politics implies that we have to rethink the role of affects in democratic politics. It is precisely the topic of your lecture today, the affects of democracy. Chantal, thank you very much for your coming. We are delighted to have this opportunity to hear you and to discuss with you the topics interesting for all of us as Europeans. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's my first trip to Belarus, and I'm very excited to be in Minsk and also to go to your introduction. This one I can see my paper. Yeah, so as a title of my talk indicates, I'm going to speak of the role of affects in politics. I have for a long time already several of my been insisting on what I call the importance of mobilizing passion, in politics. And I must say that the point when I began to speak about that, did not have many, people did not receive that in a very positive way. They was, oh no, passion, that's dangerous. And I think that for a long time, there was really a lack of understanding. Not that, this has been resolved, and I'm going to, in a moment, clarify what I mean by that. But at least to speak about passion, emotion, and affect was something bizarre in field of philosophy and political science and sociology. Well, this has changed recently because emotion of affect have recently become a very fashionable topic among philosophers and people working in social science, and also in the humanities in general. There is in fact a growing literature of what has been called the affective term. You might remember there was a few years ago linguistic term, and now people are speaking of the affective term. This designates a very heterogeneous body of work among which it's not easy to find what Wittgenstein would call family resemblance, because the theories who are sometimes put under the umbrella of the affective term come from a variety of approaches, which are in fact difficult to reconcile. They disagree on the very meaning of the term affects and emotion, not to speak of their relation. Some of them are influenced by Deleuze and Guattari, others by the neurosciences, others by a variety of constructive schools. So you can see coming from very different kind of type of thought. So I think that in order to avoid misunderstanding, because this is something very often, for instance, I've been told, but why do you speak of passion and not of emotion? And I want to, in fact, explain to you why I think it's important to make this difference. So I'm sometimes not put into the affective term, but I think that is really doesn't say very much about what is my position, since particularly, as I will say, already this affective term is something very heterogeneous. So I think that I want, in fact, to clarify my position in order to avoid misunderstanding concerning my place in the constellation of the affective term. And I think that to that some clarification are needed about what I understand by passion and how I see their role in politics. Let me stipulate at the outset that from the perspective that I advocate, it is essential to distinguish between passion and emotion. It is with regard to the political domain that my approach is being elaborated. And one of the central tenets of my approach is that in the field of the political, we are always dealing with collective identities. Something that I think the term emotion does not adequately convey. Because emotions are usually, or not always, but usually attached to individuals. To be sure, passion can also be of an individual nature, but I have chosen to speak of passion in terms of emotion, and I realize that term has got some form of a bit more violent connotation, but I think that to speak of passion allows me to underline the dimension of conflict and to suggest a confrontation between collective political identities two aspects that I take to be constitutive of politics. No, politics is about confrontation and it's about collective identities. And I think that the term passion conveys that more adequately than the term emotion. But to grasp what I understand by passion and how I see the role in politics requires to be acquainted with the theoretical framework that inform my approach. And of course, I can't expect everybody to be acquainted with it and to have my work. So I will start by recalling the main line of my conception of the political. And after that, of course, we will see the question of passion. I have suggested distinguishing between the political and politics. The political, for me, is what is linked to the dimension of antagonism, which is present in human societies. An antagonism that can emerge within a very large of social relation. For instance, I don't believe that it's only class antagonism. That was already seen that we develop in hegemony and socialist strategy. That of course there is class antagonism, but there are other forms of antagonism. So that antagonism can emerge within a variety of social relations. So that is what we call the political, this dimension of antagonism. And on the other side there is politics, which aims at establishing an order, organizing human coexistence, but always under conditions that are, so to speak, traversed by that dimension of the political, that dimension of antagonism. Well, this distinction between politics and the political, I'm certainly not the first one to admit it. In fact, we find it in other theories, though not always the same signification. We find, and of course, that can lead to some confusion. But I think that we can clarify this by distinguishing two opposing ways of characterizing the political. There are those for whom the political refers to a space of liberty, common action, and basically acting in common. That is called the associative view of the political. And there are others for whom the political is a site of conflict and antagonism. If there is politics, it's because there is this dimension of the political that in societies, the dimension of antagonism. And that, of course, is called the dissociative view of the political. When we find the associative view, it is the one which is dominant in most of political theory and certainly in the liberal thought. But here I use liberal in a very wide sense, certainly not limited to economic liberalism. Liberality, for me, the political, when I speak of the associative view, is in what is called philosophical liberalism. Philosophical liberalism, which includes people from the left and from the right. And so we put there not only people from the right, I will also put John Rawls, I will also put Habermas, and also and Hannah Arendt, by the way. So there is already big difference between the people who follow an associative view. And there is the other, the dissociative, and we find it in Thucydides, in Machiavel, in Hobbes, in Carl Schmitt, in more recently in people like Claude Lefort in France, or also, well, in Max Weber in political theory, also in Nietzsche, and more recently, of course, also in France, people like Jacques Rancière. So this is definitely the camp in which I am definitely inscribed myself into the dissociative conception of the political. The thesis that I defend is that it is only when the ineradicable character of division and antagonism is recognized, that is when you start from the perspective of the dissociative conception of the political, that it is possible to think in a properly political manner and and this is what is important, in my view, to face the challenge confronting democratic politics. Because if you start from an associative conception, there are many, many things that you will not understand. And for instance, in my more recent work, I've shown all question of populism. You can't really understand what's at stake there if you start from an associative view. So, taking account of the dimension of the political signifies acknowledging the existence of conflict that cannot have a rational solution. And in fact, this is exactly what I mean by antagonism. Antagonism is a conflict, but not any type of conflict. It's a conflict in which there is no rational solution. You need to have people who win. It's a game in which there are always people who win and people who lose. So this is what I consider by antagonism. It's important to accept that, of course, not all conflict. There are many conflicts which are not of an antagonistic nature. But I think that properly political conflicts are of that type, because they always involve decisions which require a choice between alternatives that are undecidable from a strictly rational point of view. They require to make a decision, and here I refer to the work of Jacques Derrida, who said that a real decision is always a decision which is made in an undecidable terrain. If you can find a rational solution, then you don't have to take a decision. You just follow but to take a decision means that it's a terrain in which there's no way through a series of procedure arrive at the rational solution. So this is, I think, for me, what is specific of the political. Political life, therefore, will never be able to dispense with antagonism, so it concerns public action and the formation of collective identities. It aims at constituting a we in a context of diversity and conflict. Yet, and that's another basis which is important in my work, I mean, I can't develop that here in length. Of course, I have a whole philosophical explanation for that, but I've developed in several of my writing. So, in order to constitute we, one need to be distinguished from a them. Here I follow, I mean, just to give you an indication of where I will go if I was going to explain to you that, is coming from the structural linguistic of Saussure. I say that they are, identities are always relations, that you never have an essential identity, it's always in relation to something else. So in order to have a we, and if you apply that in the field of politics, we, then you need to be able to distinguish it from them. I think that's absolutely crucial, this distinction. And, of course, it means, not all of distinction, we, them, are antagonistic, of course not. Let's be with it. In order to have a we of the Catholic, for instance, we need to have people who are not Catholic. They are Protestant, they are Muslim, they are, so them. And you, in this case, of course, simply is a true difference. But there's always the possibility that under certain conditions, this we, they, will take the form of an antagonism, that is, will be constructed as a friend and enemy confrontation. Just to give you an idea of how it could work, for instance, in Northern Ireland, with the distinction between Catholic and Protestant is not simply a distinction, pure difference. It is a distinction which is a political problem, because it is constructed. Fortunately, at the moment, there is a process to find a different way to understand that, but it is, in many cases, constructed as a friend and enemy relation. There are many other examples of one could of that. So you see that a relation which is simply a question of difference in fact, what's happening today very much with the question of with the Muslim. So the Muslims are not seen anymore simply different, but they are seen as the enemy. So this shows you all the distinction, we, they, which are not absolutely antagonistic, could become in certain circumstances antagonistic. So what I have argued is that if we start from it, politics is always about the construction of the we, and this requires the construction of the they. This construction can always become antagonistic. So this is a challenge for politics. So this is why I've argued that the crucial question for democratic politics is not how to reach a consensus without exclusion. Because much of liberal theory is, okay, we need to overcome the we-they, we are going to create a consensus in which we will agree. Well, that is impossible. Because in fact, that would amount to creating a we without a corresponding they. Because it's consensus without exclusion, there is no they. So this cannot be the aim of democratic politics. For me, the aim of democratic politics is all to construct this we-they discrimination, which is crucial in the politics, in a mode that is compatible with democratic institutions. And this is something that I think most liberal democratic theorists have to elude because of the inadequate way in which they envisage pluralism. While recognizing that we live in a world where there is a multiplicity of perspectives and values, and that it is impossible, but they believe that it is for empirical reason, that each of us will adopt all those values. Those theorists imagine that brought together all those perspectives and values constitute an harmonious and non-conflictual ensemble. This is, for instance, okay, we are limited individuals, we are in situations, we can't have the possibility of, as we say in English, putting our shoes in all those places, but somebody that would see our society from outside, what is sometimes called an overview of service, we'll see that all those different values, finally they constitute an harmonious order. And this is why they believe that the impossibility is only an empirical. Life is too short, we're only got 24 hours, but under certain conditions, it should be possible. But that's the view of pluralism that one find in most liberal theory. But there is another view of pluralism, which is the one that I advocate and I follow. It's the one that we find, for instance, in Max Weber or in Nietzsche. And the polytheism of value in Max Weber, the work of the God in Nietzsche, saying that there are multiple values and those values cannot have all reconciled. So this is why in some cases we need to make a decision. We want to adopt some values, and it's a decision which is already made in an undecidable terrain rationally. So I think you see there is two differences of understanding of pluralism. One that belongs to the associative conception of the political and one that belongs to the dissociative conception of the political. Those things are very important in order to understand what is the state in democratic politics. And of course, if you start from the conception of that liberal conception of pluralism, it is unable of accounting for the necessary conflictual nature of pluralism, which is about the, and this is why it is bound to negate the political in its antagonistic dimension. They believe that there is no such a thing of antagonism, the sense that there is always a way in which conflict can be resolved rationally. So, liberal pluralists, of course, acknowledge that in democracy, and of course here I refer to what is called modern democracy, the people can no longer be considered as one. That's their form of pluralism. But they say no, the people is multiple. But according to the dissociative view, it's not that the people are simply multiple, that people are divided. The people, there is no such a thing of people that can be all cultural. There is necessarily division among the people. This is why what antagonism means. And of course, this is also extremely important for understanding what's at stake in democratic politics. So, according to the agonistic model of democracy that I have developed in several of my writings and that I oppose to the deliberative model developed by Habermas and by John Rawls, or to the other model, the aggregative model, which mainly we find in political scientists and which is very much influenced by John Schumpeter, for instance. According to my agonistic model is a model in which I think that because both associative, aggregative, and deliberative start from a conception of the political as being associative. And I think that this is why they cannot really understand the role of antagonism, and I'm going to see in a moment the role of passion. So I have developed an alternative model of democracy, which I think to understand democracy taking account of the ineradicability of antagonism, and this is what I call the agonistic model of democracy. And this is one of the main things that I develop in my writing. According to that model, to conceive pluralist democracy in a way that does not deny the antagonistic dimension, suppose envisaging two possible mode of manifestation of this antagonistic dimension. So there is antagonism, the possibility of perfect reconciliation, but this antagonism can be put into scene, into form in two different dimensions. Either as a friend and enemy confrontation, or as a confrontation among adversaries. And this is the latter that I propose to call agonistic, because of course I agree that if you conceive of antagonism necessarily only on the mode of the friend-enemy, you cannot have a pluralist democracy. A pluralist democracy that recognizes this fact of antagonism, because as Carl Schmitt very rightly said, then of course that leads to civil war, and this is why he did not accept the possibility of a pluralist democracy. But there is another form, which is to see not the manifestation of antagonism as friend and enemy, but as adversaries. It is the agonistic confrontation is different from the antagonistic one, not because it allows for a possible consensus. In both cases, there is the antagonistic dimension, but because in that case the opponent is not considered as an enemy to be destroyed, but the side proper an adversary, but understanding by that an opponent whose existence is perceived as being legitimate. Of course, our ideas will be fought with vigor, but the right to defend those ideas will never be questioned. So we can say that the category of the enemy does not disappear, however, for it remains pertinent, but with regard to those who, because they reject what I call the conflictual consensus that constitute the basis of a pluralist democracy, cannot form part of the agonistic struggle. So not every position can be part of the agonistic struggle. So then this is why I think that the question of the limit of pluralism is therefore a crucial one, and that it's impossible for democratic politics to avoid engaging with that. It's impossible to escape this. It's not that all positions are reconcilable in an agonistic way. In the sense that they can be part of the democratic struggle, but knowing that, of course, they can never be completely reconcile. So the distinction between antagonism, no? And mind you, by that I mean a friend and enemy relation, and agonism, a relation between adversaries, permit to understand why, contrary to what many democratic theorists believe, it's not necessary to negate the ineradicability of antagonism in order to envisage the establishment of a democratic order. So this is what many people, Habermas included, say, no, if you accept antagonism, the antagonist mentioned, then there's no possibility of a democratic order. In fact, and that's what I want really to stress, the agonistic confrontation, far from representing a danger for democracy, is in reality the very condition of existence. Of course, democracy cannot survive without a certain form of consensus, but this consensus is a consensus that must relate to the allegiance, what I call the ethico-political values that constitute the principle of legitimacy of democracy, and of course of the institution in which those ethico-political principles are inscribed. We need to have a consensus on that. But it must also enable the agonistic expression of conflict, which requires that, let's say, for instance, we agree that those are the common values, in the case of democracy, liberty, equality for all, that inform our association, but of course there are going to be different understanding about what is equality, what is liberty, and who is the all. This is what I call the agonistic confrontation. So this is for me absolutely crucial, and this is what I call a conflictual consensus. Consensus on the value, dissension about their interpretation. And that, of course, requires that citizens generally have the possibility of choosing between real alternatives. There must be not one only way to understand those principles. There must be an agonistic structure, meaning that citizens, when they go to vote, for instance, have really the possibility of choosing between alternatives. So this is the first dimension of my theory, the role of antagonism. But to adequately apprehend the nature of the political, it is also necessary to introduce another dimension, the category of hegemony. And this, by the way, this is that in hegemony socialist strategy, we argue that there are two main elements to understand the political, antagonism and hegemony. To understand the political, the ever-present possibility of antagonism supposes to acknowledge the absence of the final ground and the undecidability that pervades every order. But this is precisely to this dimension that the category of hegemony refers. But it indicates that every society is the product of practices that seek to institute an order, but always in a context of contingency. There's no law of history or the weapon of the spirit, or no, it's always contingency. The social, what we call the social, is constituted by sedimented hegemonic practices. That is, practices that conceal the originary acts of their contingent political institution, and practices that appear as if they are proceeding from a natural order. This perspective, the hegemonic perspective, reveals that every order is the result from a temporary and precarious articulation of contingent practices. Here the concept of precarious contingent and temporary is absolutely crucial. Social order is therefore always of an hegemonic nature, and its origin is political. Every order is the expression of a particular structure of power relation, and it is always established through the exclusion of other possibilities. And this is why it's a political character. Well, things could always have been otherwise. There is one possibility, but there was always other possibilities. What is at stake in the agonistic struggle is the very configuration of power relation that structure a social order and the type of hegemony that they construct. It is a confrontation between hegemonic projects that can never be reconciled rationally. The antagonistic dimension is therefore always present, but it is enacted by means of a confrontation whose procedures are accepted by the adversaries. Now, this is what I understand by the agonistic. Such agonistic perspective takes account of the fact that every social order is politically instituted, and that the ground on which hegemonic intervention occurs is never neutral, for it is always the product of previous hegemonic practices. And this is why we see the public sphere as the battlefield on which hegemonic projects confront one another with no possibility of a final reconciliation. So those are the main theses of the conception of the political that inform my approach. Well, at this point, and before moving to the issue of passion, I would like to dispel a frequent confusion and spell out the differences between radical democracy and the agonistic model of democracy. Because, of course, in hegemony, we also advocate, on the basis of the theoretical approach, a form of politics we call what we propose is to redefine the socialist project in terms of radicalization of democracy. This is what, but it's a political project, radical democracy. And the question of agonistic democracy is something that I have developed later. And I think it's important to see the difference. Those two terms cannot be used indistinctively, as it is sometimes the case, because they refer to different aspects of my reflection. For instance, in hegemonic socialist strategy, criticizing the class reductionism that we felt dominated in the Marxist tradition, we argued, as I was just saying, for a new understanding of the socialist project in terms of radicalization of democracy. So I just say that's the political aspect of it. And we advocated what we call the creation of a chain of equivalence among democratic demands. So in order to extend the democratic principle to a wider set of social relations. So this is a political project. This process of radicalization of democracy, as we argue, implied to articulate the demand of the working class with the demand of the social movement and the demand of the communist movement, of the anti-racism. This was the main political aspect of the hegemonic socialist strategy. Radical democracy, as envisaged, is clearly a political project to be distinguished from other political projects like, for instance, the social democratic or the neoliberal one. But the agonistic model of democracy is something different. It is an analytical approach, formulated as an alternative, as I already indicated, to the aggregative and the deliberative model. In fact, after writing Hegemonic Socialist Strategy, while scrutinizing the discussion among liberal democratic theorists, I became aware of the limitation of the consensual understanding of democracy. And I realized that neither the aggregative nor the deliberative model allow us to visualize the possibility of an hegemonic politics. To give account of the ineradicability of antagonism and of the hegemonic nature of politics, a different model was needed. A model that would be able to address the following issue. how to envisage democracy within the framework of our hegemonic approach. How could a democratic order acknowledge and manage the existence of conflict that did not have a rational solution? Or to conceive democracy in a way that allows in its midst a confrontation between conflicting hegemonic projects. Those are the questions that I have done. And my answer to those questions is the agonistic model of democracy. Because I see this model as providing the analytical framework necessary to visualize the possibility of a democratic confrontation between hegemonic projects. Asserting the constitutive character of social division and the impossibility of a final reconciliation, the agonistic perspective recognizes the necessary partisan character of democratic politics. By envisaging this confrontation in terms of adversaries and not on the friend-enemy mode, because of course as I said that could lead to civil war, this model allows for a confrontation to take place within democratic institutions. Now, this was for me the main question. Nonetheless, and this is important, this agonistic model does not take side in the confrontation between hegemonic projects. And it is erroneous, as some people have made, to believe that an agonistic model definitively favors the radical democratic project. One thing is to create the condition for an hegemonic confrontation. Now this is what the agonistic model is going to do. A completely different one is to determine what's going to be the outcome of this confrontation. This outcome will always be the result of political struggle between forces that are struggling for hegemony. But nothing guarantees the victory of one project over another. You can perfectly have an agonistic struggle that is going to lead to, and I think that's very important, to particularly to today, when we are thinking of question of populism, to the political forces. You can know. I mean, you know how the question should be posed, but you cannot predict in advance what's going to be the result. So the result of an agonistic confrontation is certainly not a guarantee for a radical democratic project. So I think that's very important to understand that. Okay. After those general considerations, I think we are now in condition to examine what I call the role of passion in politics. As I have already indicated, by using the term passion, I want to distinguish my reflection from the issue of individual emotion. More precisely, when I speak of passion, I designate a certain type of common affect. So passion, I use it in a specific way. Common affects. That is the affects that are mobilized in the political domain in the formation of a we-they form of identification. Because I think that the creation of a we, of a collective will, is always a crystallization of common affects. And this is, what I understand my passion, common affect that crystallize in a collective identity. My aim, of course, here is to challenge the rationalist view dominant in democratic political theory by underlying both the collective and the partisan character of political action, bringing to light the crucial role played by affect in the construction of political identities. One of my key criticism of liberal democratic theories is their incapacity to acknowledge this affective dimension. Incapacity which I take to be the consequence of their picture of the individual presented as acting in the field of politics us move either by the pursuit of our interest, that's of course the aggregative model, or by moral success, the deliberative one. And I think that this precludes them from recognizing the collective nature of political actors and asking one of the key questions for politics. How are collective form of identification created, and what is the part played by affect in this process? And this is what my reflection of passion and address. I am of course aware, and that's something that a lot of people phrase again, passion is usually a negative connotation, being perceived by many liberal individualists as referring affects of an irrational and undesirable nature. But it is precisely this view that I want to challenge. To begin with, the study of passion was at the center of the reflection of 17th century philosophers like Hobbes, Descartes, Spinoza, and Pascal. And at that moment, they did not have a total negative connotation. It's only later where it was displaced by Enlightenment rationalism that the term passion was quite a negative connotation. In fact, we had to wait to Freud and the development of psychoanalysis to revive and reformulate the theme that had been explored by early modern theories of the passion. Among those early modern theories, I think that Spinoza is particularly relevant for our current situation. And in fact, it's interesting to see that his affinity between this notion of the conatus and Freud, one of libido, has often been pointed to. So there is clearly, affinity between, not at all level, but on certain aspects between Freud and Spinoza. Emphasizing the role of passion is no doubt open to the objection that those passions can be mobilized in ways which will undermine democratic institutions. Of course, yes. But I think this is clearly, the field that leads many theorists to exclude them from democratic politics. But as I have pointed out very often, this is a very perilous viewpoint, because refusing to provide democratic channels for the expression of collective common affects lays the terrain for antagonistic form of their mobilization. And I think that it is therefore vital for agonistic politics and for democratic politics in general, whose objective is the construction of a we-they in terms of adversaries and not in terms of enemies, to envisage the condition under which adversarial common affects can be brought about, instead of saying, oh no, that necessarily are going to be used in a way which is going to undermine democratic institutions. To examine this question, of course, this is not what I'm going to do here, it will take much more time, but to examine this question, I want just to give you some ideas of how one can address it. I think that psychoanalysis provides important insight that can be made fruitful politically through their articulation with the discursive hegemonic perspective that I have outlined earlier. Freud brought to the fore the crucial role played by the affective libidinal bonds in processes of collective identification. As he states in his book, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, and here I quote Freud, a group is clearly held together by a power of some kind, and to what power could this feed be better ascribed than to Eros, which holds together everything in the world. End of quote. So it insists on the role, of Eros common affect in creation of collective identity, creation of the. Since affect are conceived as being malleable and susceptible of being oriented in different directions, that's the view of Freud, the task for radical democratic politics is to foster affective libidinal attachment that will contribute to the formation of a movement, what I call a counter-hegemonic movement, a collective will that is precisely trying to bring about a more radical democratic politics. How can this be realized? Of course, it's a very big question. And again, I'm not going to give any solution here, but I submit that we can find some insight in Spinoza's conception of the affect. Namely, a distinction that he made between affection and affectus. That is, translating that affection and affect. Like Freud, Spinoza believed that it is desire that moves human beings to act. And we know that what makes them act in one direction rather than another are the affects. An affection, affection, is in fact a state of a body insofar as it is subject to the action of another body. So they need affection, you have a state, let's call it a certain practice in which you are inscribed. When affected by something exterior, the conatus, and of course for Spinoza the conatus is the general striving to persevere in our being, that's central in Spinoza's views. So the conatus will experience when he is put in certain affection, certain states, the conatus will experience affects that will move it to desire something and to act accordingly. I think it's very important to see the process. And this is, I think, that the dynamic of affectio affectus is important because for Spinoza, okay, we are inscribing certain, I think we need to adopt what we call affection, certain state, certain practices. Those practices are making people feel, experience affects. Those affects push them to decide, think, and of course desire for them to act. So if we are going to try to imagine, if we want people to act politically to that direction, we need to think of what are the kind of affection that are more adequate to produce the affects that are going to need to decide to act in let's say, the sense of radicalization of democracy. So, again, to repeat what I just said, I think that the dynamic of affection affectus is helpful to envisage the process of production of common affects. And I propose to employ this dynamic to examine the mode of creation and transformation of political identities, seeing affection, the spaces where the discursive and the affective are articulated in specific practices. I think that that's how we can, if the question that how are we going to create new form of subjectivity, we need to think of what kind of practices that can create those affect affect that are going to lead into a certain direction. Well, I don't want to develop this too much here because I would like to end by making some kind of to go to politics from I know that my talk has been very theoretical, but I think that it's a theory which is important, relevant for politics. And I think that the reflection I've just presented suggests that for those who want to contribute to a radical politics of what I call a counter-engagement. Of course, if I want to say, I'm speaking, and of course, the situation that I know is the situation in Western Europe. So my reflection politically is concerning the situation in Western Europe. In fact, I want to insist that I always think that one needs to start from specific conjuncture. I'm not at all the kind of political theorist who wants to speculate about what the world should be. No, I think we start from a specific conjuncture, we try to analyze it and then to see what can be done in order to transform it. So my reflection political is very much an analysis of specific conjuncture. For instance, my book, For the Republic, is an analysis of the conjuncture today in Western Europe, and I insist Western Europe. I don't deal, for instance, with populism in Hungary or in Poland, because I think that those are different conjunctures. You cannot just apply the model of Western Europe to those countries, because their history is different. The whole of the communism and they've got different political experience. So I think they need to be studied in their specific context. So this is to call attention to the fact that this is a reflection that I learned from Western Europe. But I hope that some of those ideas could also, resonate with you and make you can appropriate them and maybe apply them to your situation. So I think that my interest, of course, in the case of Western Europe is how can we develop counter-hegemonic engagement with neoliberal institutions? And that's my political question. And I think that if that is our political question, one important task is to cultivate a multiplicity of practices that will erode the common affect, sustaining the current neoliberal hegemony. Those practices, counter-hegemonic practices that erode the common affect that exists at the moment and can sustain neoliberal hegemony, these other practices should aim at fostering affect of a different nature. The counter-hegemonic politics necessitates the creation of a different regime of desire and affect, so as to bring about a collective will, a we, sustained by common affect, able to challenge the existing neoliberal order. That is what I understand by the mobilization of fashion, or to create this mobilization into a direction which is going to make visualize the possibility of another hegemony. And I think that this mobilization of passion, I take it to be the condition for the success of progressive politics. There can be no progressive politics, and this is something that not something for Western Europe only. I mean, I think that's also could be useful for you. It's always you can't have progressive politics or just without mobilization of passion. Unfortunately, I think generally left parties, and again I'm speaking for Western Europe, do not understand the importance of mobilizing passion in a democratic direction. They believe that this is something that is specific to the right, mobilizing passion on the right, and we, the group Democrat, the left, we should limit ourselves to rational argument and deliberative procedure. And this is why they are not able to answer the challenge posed by the rise of right-wing populist movement. For the success of those movements is linked to the fact that they understand much better than the left that politics is always partisan and that it requires the creation of us-them creation. They are aware of the importance of constructing collective political identities and of fostering the development of a collective will, that is, a collective will, we, of course, that through common affect. This is something that we cannot understand. And I think that this is what explains the growing success of right-wing populism in many European countries. Because besides the South, this is something that they understand better. One part of the collective will. They have managed in anti-populist parties in many European countries to foster a new form of collective identification about the notion of the people, which is constructed in certain way, because the people is not insist. Of course, when I refer to the people, it's not an empirical reference, it's not a sociological category. It's a political construction. The people is always, it's not the population. The people is a political construction. And of course, right-wing populism construct the people in a very specific way, in a way that curtails democracy, instead of leading to radicalization of democracy. However, so of course, I think that this is where we can decide that. But I think that the best way to fight against those parties is not by accusing them of populism, condemning their appeal to affects, and claiming that democratic politics must be based exclusively on rational argument, and that it is necessary to expel passion from politics. This is unfortunately the main view of liberalism. I'm convinced that such a stance represents the main obstacle in the elaboration of a strategy to challenge our post-democratic condition. What is at stake, and this is the argument I developed in my more recent book for real populism, is the construction of another people, of a progressive collective will, able to crystallize affect, aiming at the deepening of democracy, not to restrict the restriction of democracy to the national, because Spinoza, to give him the last word, was keen to stress, an affect can only be displayed by an opposed affect, stronger than the one to be repressed. And I think that's what is saying. How can we develop affect that's stronger than the one that has to be mobilized by writing politics? This is, I think, the task of democratic politics today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking talk. Dear colleagues, dear guests, now we open floor for audience, for discussions, for questions. Short pause. Just a moment. Мы прояснили процедуру. У нас будет два микрофона, и кто хочет задать вопрос или какой-то дать комментарий, приглашаем. Пожалуйста, первая рука.
I don't have a translation.
Translation?
No, I don't have a
Because you speak in English. Why does they speak Russian?
No, she was not speaking English. You are speaking English?
In Russian.
Yes, exactly. That's what I thought.
Я все перевела, и у меня включена кнопка второй канал, английский язык, все должно работать.
Хорошо, пожалуйста, мы приглашаем. Вы уже здесь. И, пожалуйста, представьтесь. И когда будете задавать вопрос, не очень быстро. Хорошо, чтобы и очередь составлялась.
Хорошо. Меня зовут Александр. У меня следующий вопрос. Я думаю, что основная цель существования демократических институтов, да, то есть таковых, в тех реалиях, которые сейчас есть на Западе, это борьба за привилегии и за материальные ресурсы какие-то, которые существуют. Для этого эти группы борются за какую-то власть. Проблема заключается в том, что по другую сторону западного мира у людей зачастую нету этих ни привилегий, ни ресурсов, то есть они сосредоточены в Европе. Как вы думаете, какое будущее европейской демократии, если в один момент Европа лишится и привилегий, и ресурсов, которыми она сейчас обладает, то есть европейцы? будет ли существовать демократия в том виде, который у нас сейчас существует.
Well, I mean, it depends if you believe that democracy in Europe is conditioned by all those things that you said. Well, obviously, there's no future, but there's also absolutely. I don't agree that with this thesis that democracy can only exist because of that. And in any case, I consider that this. I made very briefly reference to that, to use the term in my talk. I don't think that we live in democracies in Western Europe. We live in post-democracies. And this is, of course, something that I want to develop in my work, because I don't want to...
Excuse me, please speak closer to the mic.
Okay, I got it, but okay. Yes, all right. For instance, and I think that is definitely a consequence of neoliberal hegemony. I value in my work that what we understand, when we in Western Europe speak of democracy, of course, and I'm not referring to right-wing people, but the political theorists that develop. Oops. There is a specific Western model of democracy, because for instance I think that democracy for me is a principle of legitimacy that can be inscribed differentially in different contexts. The way it has been inscribed in the Western context is in the articulation between two different traditions. The liberal tradition, but if I speak of the tradition of political liberalism, as represented, for instance, by Stuart Mill, by that I understand separation of power, defense of the rule of law, the defense of human rights. That's what liberal political tradition, and in fact, the tradition is I think perfectly valuable. And the democratic tradition, whose ideas are basically central ideas, are equality and popular sovereignty. So on one side, you've got a tradition, liberal that insists more on liberty, and the other one on democracy. And in fact, as it has been argued by the economical theorist Macpherson, what we've seen in the 19th century, turn of the 19th century, in Europe, it's an articulation between those two traditions. And say, it comes to that, democracy is being liberalized and liberally democratized. In fact, when we speak of the Republican model, which is a Republic, the idea of the Republic is precisely that. It's an articulation between liberal and democracy. Okay. But there is much things to say about the kind of articulation that didn't necessarily must create a social problem, because, again, I don't want to enter into too many philosophical discussion here, but there are people, liberalism and democracy, what is their relation? Is it a relation in which, as Habermas argued, co-originality, or is it something like Karl would argue something that is necessarily, there is a contradiction. In my book, The Democratic Paradox, I have argued that we should see that not as a contradiction, but certainly not as co-originality, but as a mode of attention. Because I think that what I understand by agonism is precisely the fact that this renegotiation between liberty and equality, there's always this kind of struggle between those two dimensions. And in fact, what corresponds, in a sense, to what we call the left and the right is also Norberto Bobbio, in a nice little book called Left and Right, precisely insists on that. The right always tends to privilege the question of liberty and don't give so much importance to equality, and the left is more privileging equality. Well, what is happened with neoliberalism is that this agonistic tension is being eliminated because today everything is got to do with the democratic tradition, equality and popular sovereignty is being eliminated. It's only the question of liberty and understood again in a very, very individualistic way, not much to be left in common with America, for instance. So this is something which, when we speak of democracy, in fact, we speak of societies in which everything which is got to do with democracy is being eliminated. And this is what I think that we are doing in all democracies. All democracy, because all our societies still call themselves democracy, but they are not democracy. For me, as I said in my talk, a democracy requires an agonistic confrontation between, different different values, different projects of society, and this is not the case anymore in the moment in Western Europe. So, the question of the future of democracy, for me, I wouldn't put it like that. I would want to say, how can we recover democracy after? And of course, this idea of recovering democracy and radicalizing democracy would imply, and then I think I will agree with the thing that you were saying, for instance, tackling the question of inequality at the world level. For me, the radicalization of democracy, which I propose as a political project, should put into question precisely those issues that you say you present that as being necessary for the existence of democracy. I don't believe that. I think we are in a situation where there is a real perversion of democracy. And that's what I call post-democracy. So you see, I don't agree with the way you put the question that saying, okay, because what I want is to fight against the situation existing today in post-democratic societies to create, this new vision of radicalization of democracy, which of course, will deal with all those issues. And in a sense, I could agree with you that if this does not happen, if those societies go on following the model of neoliberalism, then of course I don't see any future for democracy. But I think that there in fact renewal the possibility of recovering democracy. And in fact, my whole argument for left populism is precisely to say how are we going to recover democracy in order to radicalize it.
Спасибо за лекцию. Я бы хотел спросить, с одной стороны, конечно, когда вы говорите о страсти в политику и впускании страсти в политическую жизнь, интеграцию к иррациональной стороне и мобилизации, основанной на этих страстях, это напоминает, конечно, выпускание джина из бутылки, который должен привести к новой мобилизации масс и радикальному противостоянию, я так понимаю, с тем, что вы называете неолиберализмом, который, собственно, и привел к отмиранию демократии. Тогда эта радикализация, основанная на мобилизации через страсть, она в этом смысле является обоснованной в вашей теории. Но с другой стороны, любая радикализация, и вы тоже об этом говорите, ведет к противопоставлению «мы» и «они», которое располагается на этих двух линиях. Мы можем номинировать другого как врага, а можем видеть его как конкурента в вашей модели. И для того, чтобы вернуться к какому-то построению конкурентной агонистической модели демократии, мы с необходимостью сталкиваемся с тем, что неолиберализм, как вы это называете, становится нашим врагом. И для того, чтобы установить новую агонистическую модель демократии, нам необходимо победить последнего врага, который стоит на пути этой демократии, низвергнуть его, так сказать, и установить новый порядок ценностей, на котором появится новая агонистическая модель демократии. Вот мой вопрос, как бы, не является ли такого рода как бы, идея утопией? И на этом установлении мы не приходим к установлению агонистической демократии, а просто устанавливаем новый, в другой степени порядок там, гегемонии, но как бы, такой же недемократический, как и ранее.
Well, it's very difficult for me to engage with your question because you are reiterating exactly the view that I'm criticizing. You know, so you are starting from the view that passion are necessarily rational and that I put that into question. You know, it's like in a sense you are repeating exactly the position which I've been saying I'm against. So I do believe that passion can be also, and by that I understand common affects can be of many. There is passion for equality, passion for justice, passion and I'm exactly putting into question this idea that mobilization of affects is necessarily something irrational. For instance, we introduce the term irrational, which I absolutely challenge. I don't think that it makes sense to speak of irrational when we are at that level. Because for me, exactly the rationalistic view what I've been criticizing. So I don't really see how and to engage with your question because we are starting from basically opposite ontological point of view. I mean, my argument is precisely and articulated. I think that the problem of the left or the liberal, progressive liberal, as you want to call them, is the one who want to mobilize it are that they start from they don't recognize the importance of the affective dimension in politics, in the construction of collective identity. And there is something, I'm not a total Deleuze but there is something that Deleuze say, which I really identify with. Deleuze say, c'est une French and after translate, il y a des images de la pensée qui empêchent de penser. Il y a image of thought that impede to think. And I would say there are image of politics that impede to think politics. And I think precisely this idea that normal politics to the rationalities that impede to think politics. And this is why I am really concerned that people who call themselves left progressive in that don't manage to break with that conception.
Thank you, Chantal, for the wonderful presentation. I have a question, maybe it's a little... I have to speak in Russian?
No,
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Good. The question I have is maybe a little off to the side of the particular presentation, and that is the problem of theorizing the state, or even maybe the party, a party of some sort, perhaps a radical democratic party. And the reason I bring this up is it seems in the post-68 era that the left has given away that ground quite a bit, has sort of actually attacked the idea of the state. And maybe to some degree your work, in a constructive way, has raised those questions as well. The right, of course, the libertarian right, has the same attitude towards the state as we see now more and more. My question is, in the United States context, I feel that that lack of a theorization, this sort of abandonment of that question, has allowed someone whose name I won't even give you here to drive a truck right through the middle. Does that make sense? My question?
I'm sorry, but I don't really understand what's the question.
Why is the left withdrawn from analyzing or rethinking the question of the state?
Well, the question of the state is very important, and I tackled that in detail it's a short book, but I tackled that. There's a chapter on that in my book for populism. But here, and you are right, in fact, to say that we find this attitude also in fact, in a sense, it could be rather paradoxical that we find both in the ultra-left and the libertarian the same kind of opposition to the state. So but for different reasons, of course. But I think that, well, again, I mean, my book is critical of this position of the ultra-left that believes that free society or democracy requires the abolition of the state. In fact, what I distinguish between, it depends on, some people see the state as something that is necessarily oppressive, necessarily. So we need to get rid of, to abandon the state. Others, of course, believe that the state cannot be transferred. The state is something that is institution. I think that the state is always a crystallization of relation of power, and that the state can be transferred. So let's say, in one sense, I'm critical of the present way the state functions, but I don't go to the point of saying we demolish it. My position is what I call radical reformism. And in fact, I distinguish for left populism three ways to understand the left. There is what I call the pure reformist left. It's the reformist of the social democrats today, which I think are in fact social liberals, and which is, for instance, move to be dominant in Western Europe during and in fact, in a sense, as a consequence of the hegemony of neoliberalism. I mean, the model of the third way, developed in Britain by Tony Giddens and put in practice by Tony Blair, but of course, this is the model that is, you can think of François Hollande, in France, of Renzi. I mean, basically, the social democratic left has capitulated to neoliberalism and accepted the idea that there is no alternative to neoliberalism. Remember, I don't know if it's completely, but Margaret Thatcher, which was called Tina, because there is no alternative to neoliberalism. But unfortunately, the social democratic left have accepted that. So they defend the state, yeah, they think the state, but they don't believe that one can reform profoundly the state. For them, the only possibility when they come to power, a little bit more of a redistribution, but there is not a real idea that the relation of power in the state can be transferred. That's one problem. On the other extreme, you've got the so-called revolutionary left, or they say no, the state need to be abolished, destroyed, or bypassed. And for instance, the work of Arthur Negri also, they believe in the kind of self-organization of society. I mean, of course, the model that I developed in the dissociativity of the politics. I mean, we need, the state is important as a way of mediation between different forces. So I think that the state is for me absolutely a crucial in this. That also, and by the way, also are parties, because I think parties are the way in which this agonistic struggle can be put into form, in the way in which pluralism can be put into form. So I am against this kind of thinking, which is very fashionable at the moment among the left. We should not be parties, we should not be the society should auto-organize itself. And the idea of the common, which is so à la mode, fashionable, the common. I think I'm very critical of that. I think that because precisely I start from a conception that the world will be antagonism, we need parties to organize the pluralism, and we need the state as an instance where the conflict can be kind of not resolve and find a way of mediation. But I think that the state is not something monolithic. It can be transformed, and that's what I different idea, what I call radical reformism. So it's reformism because it's not the ultra left that wants to get rid, but it's radical because it's different from the reformism of the social liberal who believes that there is no alternative. So this is for me what is very important in my conception of left populism. But I agree that is among the left today, and you can find that in many different ways, because of course there is the traditional Marxist left, which is not so important today, but there are many other forms, the form of the common, or which is, the state is definitely something which is not, there is a very strong anti-state tendency in the left, and I think that it's important to fight against that. But of course, insisting that the state is a crystallization of relation of power, and we need to act in order to transfer those relations of power, to put the state, at the service of the citizen, which would then allow the state that the state will become an instrument through which the citizen can really, democratize society. But I do believe in the possibility of using the state for radicalization of democracy.
We can have a passionate state.
Of course, yes.
Spicy.
Okay, I will also ask my question in English if you don't mind. You need a text of your presentation. My question relates slightly to the previous one, and it concerns the concept of Germany that you mentioned in your presentation. In this respect, I would like to ask you, how would you assess the current international order and the role of the United States in it? Do you agree that the United States, especially after the presidency of Trump, can still be considered a liberal hegemon? And if yes, to what extent does it have the right to sort of intervene in other countries promoting the human rights and liberal values? How would you assess that? Thank you.
Well, I never believed that the United States was a liberal hegemon, not even before Trump, So that was, of course, their propaganda. But look, it's enough to see all their intervention, and of course, I'm particularly linked with Latin America. Gosh, all their intervention in Chile, in Guatemala, it has always been in order to defend. And you don't need to go in Iran, everywhere where there has been left-wing government, which the Americans thought they could, in a sense, go in there, they intervene in order to bring those governments. So I don't see where is the idea of the liberal hegemon. So I think that it was never the liberal hegemon. Let's say, what is new with Trump is that he's not an hypocrite. Before, the other one, they were hypocrites. They would say, we are thinking in the good of the humanity, and we are developing democracy. But we see, I think that we are today, in the world in general, in a big mess. And in great part is a result of the American intervention in Iraq, and then in Libya, where the French collaborated to that. All the problems together. People say, oh, this question of immigration, they in the name of exporting democracy, they destroyed the sense of regime, which has created the situation extremely dangerous. I think we are at a very dangerous geopolitical moment. And in fact, the Americans and the Europeans to a certain extent, I don't want to exclude our responsibilities. I mean, Tony Blair in Iraq, the French in Libya, but this idea of a liberal hegemon, no, I don't buy that idea at all.
So you would argue that there are no liberal hegemons at all?
No, I don't believe in liberal hegemon. In any case, the question is that I deal with the question of in my book Argonistic, I discuss. It's a lot of discussion which is linked mainly to the question of cosmopolitanism. in which okay, I explain that. I've been defending what I call that the multipolar world, because I think that the idea that we can have, and that's why I'm critical of the cosmopolitan. The cosmopolitan said we need to go towards a society where there won't be any more hegemony. And this would end up with the left United Nations or something like that. No, I don't believe that. I believe that, as I said in my talk, every order is necessarily an hegemonic order. That's true also at international level. So it's always, and in fact, if we were arriving to a situation which would say there is no more hegemon, that it would be in fact a situation in which there is one hegemon that has become is so much managed to convince people that their politics is coincide with the common good of the humanity, that they will not be considered. But of course, I think it will be a terrible situation. So there will always be hegemony, and I think that the best way, in fact, is what I think of pluralization of hegemonies. Because then there will be, in fact, some kind of balance. In a sense, I think that the bipolar world, with all the problems that is there, was a much more stable world than the current world. Because there was, to a certain extent, limits to what the Americans could do. No, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they believe that they can do what they want everywhere. And I think that for me that is not good. I think that, but on the other side, I don't think that we can go to a beyond hegemony. But what we should do is to have multiple regional hegemonies, so that that would create, in fact, some kind of agonistic form of world politics. Because I think that when there is only one country or one region that appears as being one defending values, the truth, the values, then of course you cannot accept any challenge. And we've seen very much that, for example, with Bush particularly, when we say that every people who disagree with us is our enemy. And I think, let's say, what I think we need to try to create some kind of order where we have the possibility of recognizing differences and not to treat different as enemies, as antagonists, but as agonistic. This is for me what is important. If we try to imagine what would be an agonistic model of the world system, of course we need to recognize that every region are going to be this some tendency of wanting to have impose an order, but what we need is to have counter hegemony, to limit the design to control the world politics.
Well, colleagues, we have already 5 people with questions, so I would suggest that we gather now all the questions and we stop at the slide. That we gather all questions and then Chantal will give comments and answers after hearing your question.
Равен Андрей, в первую очередь поблагодарить за содержательную лекцию, за презентацию, артикуляцию ключевых идей.
There is no translation.
Этот микрофон.
Спасибо за вашу содержательную лекцию, за артикуляцию ключевых идей вашего творчества для белорусской аудитории. это действительно важно. У меня два вопроса маленьких, один о прошлом и один о будущем. О прошлом, скорее, буквоедский вопрос. Долгое время мы исследовали, интерпретировали, читали тексты Шанталь Муфт, наверное, начиная с гегемонии стилистической стратегии, во фрейме постмарксизма и не проводя четкого различия, spelling the difference between Шанталь Муфт, Эрнест Лакло и даже иногда Жижу. Вопрос, помогите нам провести это различие тех времен гегемонии стилистической стратегии между теоретическими позициями Шанталь Муфт и Эрнеста Лакло, если эти различия были. И второй вопрос о будущем. Вы сами сказали, что ваша...
Wait a second, I've done that attention. You are asking what are the difference between me and Ernesto Laclau, is that what you are asking?
At the time of publishing in 1985, Hegemony and Solis
If we had differences?
Yeah, I have a difference.
No, we did not have any difference. I mean, we wrote the book together, so we did not have any.
It was agonistic model.
No. We could. I tell you that we could never have written a book together if we had differences, because we were together very passionate about our ideas, and that was impossible. So that question I can already answer straight away. And the second one?
Второй вопрос о будущем. Вы сами сказали, что ваша речь была достаточно теоретической, слишком теоретической. Есть ли у вас более практические советы, рецепты, не только как развивать неолиберальную гегемонию, но как способствовать демократии в демократических обществах, в демократических государствах? Возможно, есть что-то для кейса Беларуси. Спасибо.
По возможности, пожалуйста, конечно.
Я хотела тоже поблагодарить Шанталь Муфт не только за лекцию и за презентацию, но и, в принципе, за интеллектуальный проект Шанталь Муфт и Эрнеста Лаклау. То есть я полагаю, что все-таки аналогов вот такого радикально антиэссенциалистского подхода к обществу в теоретических моделях на сегодня нет. И мне кажется, что этот проект вот именно в теоретической части достаточно мало оценен. Да? То есть все-таки вот этот способ мыслить социально, радикально нефигуративным образом, он кажется довольно продуктивным, креативным, интересным, но довольно мало востребованным. Вот как вообще вас принимают в интеллектуальных кругах, насколько понимают, например, тезис Эрнеста Лаклау «Общество не существует», да, буквально ли его прочитывают, или за этим есть действительно считывается какая-то другая социальная онтология. И мой вопрос тоже, в общем-то, где-то пересекался с вопросом Андрея, насколько действительно есть ли расхождение. Иногда кажется, что теоретическая модель Лаклау – это одно, а ваш способ мыслить политику вот, в конкретном ее проявлении – это немножко другое. А здесь вот эта фигуративность как-то все-таки работает. Вот. Это ремарка такая, да. И, ну, может быть, еще один вопрос небольшой. Скажите, а сами интеллектуалы или те, кто описывают общество, да, вот социальный философ, он является политическим агентом, да, он способен как-то переартикулировать политическое поле таким образом, чтобы оно, ну, там, не знаю, новую точку пристежки получило. Да? Как вообще, собственно, вы видите себя как социального философа в роли политического агента, политической силы?
Спасибо еще раз за ваш чудесный доклад. Я глубоко солидарен с вашей позицией относительно роли коллективных эмоций, формирования коллективных идентичностей, формирования политических позиций. И в этом контексте у меня вопрос, который является следствием, натуралистическим следствием вашего аргумента о роли коллективных эмоций. Дело в том, что, как вы знаете, существует много исследований, показывающих то, что в результате мобилизации посредством коллективных эффектов формируются агрессивные позиции. То есть идея, при которой коллективный эффект приводил бы к агонистической модели, а не к антагонистической модели, на основании тех исследований, которые проводятся сейчас, она кажется в некотором смысле идеальной, что ли, потому что чаще всего бывает, что при мобилизации эффектов происходит как раз-таки накал антагонизма, происходит формирование идентичности по принципу «мы», «они» и по принципу «друзья-враги». Как модель, агонистическая модель демократии справляется вот с этим натуралистическим следствием из теории коллективных эффектов, из теории коллективных эмоций? Спасибо.
Добрый день, большое спасибо за доклад. У меня очень короткий вопрос. Вы упомянули позицию радикального реформирования. В связи с этим вопрос. Если мы ставим цель if we want to recreate democracy, воссоздать демократию, то какие конкретные шаги мы должны предпринять? И если обращаться к тому, что вы сказали в самом начале вашего выступления, если Западная Европа и Восточная Европа — это очень разные поля, то какие шаги должны быть в каждом из этих полей? Спасибо.
Спасибо. Насколько я понял, вы настаиваете на контингентности, а не историчности в гегелевском смысле социальных порядков. Мой вопрос: являются ли страсти историческими? Не являются ли страсти тем, что привносит историческое в социальные порядки? Спасибо.
Okay, I'll start from I mean, I don't really understand what is a position contingent rather than historical. I don't see where one is the position. I think historic for me is precisely a contingent process. So I wouldn't say that, of course, there is another view that believe that history is necessarily the product of what if we follow Marxism is the development of the contradiction economic level, if we follow it again the history of the spirit, if we follow another more modernist, they are of course views that believe that history is moved by something which, you know, there is a law of history, okay? And of course there is some disagreement concerning which law of history. But of course what I'm putting into question is this view of history is not opposing the historical and the contingent, is to say that the historical is always a product of contingent practices. So it's putting criticizing a certain idea of the movement of history, but it's certainly not opposing the contingent and the historical. Yeah, the question of radical reform, you see, it's always, people always want me to say, okay, what should we do? I mean, what should we do in Belarus? I have absolutely no idea. I don't know enough about the situation here, and I certainly don't believe that the role of an electoral is to give recipe. Even in the case which I know best, because this is where I live, in the case of Western Europe, I don't think that the role of theorists is to tell people what they should do. I think what is important is this to help people to understand their situation, to understand what's happening. And then from then on, you know, they will decide if they want to this is why I was insisting, you know, on the distinction between the project of radicalization of democracy and the agonistic one. What I insist is that if you want to act politically, you need to, in whatever ways, they are not, you need to understand exactly what makes a specific conjuncture. And of course, you know, what is the stake, and are we, this is also why I think it's important to situate yourself into a specific perspective. I mean, that for me is to be clear from where you are speaking, from where you are either speaking from associative model, and I think many people, without even recognizing that, because it's the common sense, it's the view which is more developed, are thinking from an associative model. And I want here to say that there is another way to see it. Another way which I think is more productive, because I think that there are many things that you cannot understand politically if you start from the associative model. But again, if, for instance, I would never, and I think that probably is important to steer that, I would never argue that I've got the truth, that I've got, I would never think I'm right and Habermas is wrong, for instance. But for me, I don't think there is truth. The question of truth is not pertinent at that level. And politics is always partisan, so you choose your stand. But I don't think that, choosing the stand of the left is to be on the side of the truth, and then the right on the side of the wrong. And also, I don't think that, for instance, soon I'm going to take part in a discussion in France about the good and the bad populism. What I'm going to say from the beginning is that I excluded this distinction, because I don't want to introduce that kind of moral categories into politics. I'm of course defending populism, but I do not say that it's a good populism, but I think it's irrelevant to do those categories. And in the same way, for instance, I think that it does not make sense to say that my view of history is the right one, that the truth and Habermas and all the other. What I'm not defend some kind of relativism, because what I will argue is that if you start, but here, in fact, my argument is very pragmatic argument. I will argue, if you start from the dissociative conception of the political, you are going to be able to understand many phenomena that you can't understand if you start from an associative conception. I think, for instance, specifically, the question of populism, you cannot understand that if you start from the associative conception, because populism is necessarily and here I, in fact, follow the distinction that has been established by Ernesto Laclau on populist reason. Populism is a strategy of construction of the political frontier. It's a strategy, it's a way of how to construct the us and the them. It's a strategy, it's not a regime, it's not the ideology, it's not it's the thing, you construct the frontier. Okay, if you start from conception according to which there is no frontier, which is the formal one, everybody is associative concept, there is no frontier, there is no us and them, then of course you can't understand populism, because you are necessarily going to see that as some kind of irrational thing, something that we need to combat. While if you recognize that there is antagonism, that society is part, then you can understand what's at stake in populism. They construct a frontier, So this is the kind of argument I will make again. A few years ago, for instance, I was arguing that there was so much incapacity on the part of liberal theorists to understand what was at stake in the disintegration of Yugoslavia. The end of history had been proclaimed by Fukuyama. There was no more antagonism. Things should know that the Soviet Union had collapsed. We should all, be no more antagonism. And then some kind of general peace was going to happen. And then, of course, the conflict of Yugoslavia. I mean, I was very struck by the fact that for many political theorists, they could not understand that according to their scheme, that should not have happened, and then, well, of course, it's the Balkan, but the Balkan, they are a bit behind, they are necessarily not quite modern. Or there were some other people who were saying, but that's still the remnant of communism, So they were not really understanding what was at stake, because there, clearly, what happened in Yugoslavia is, and I think from my point of view of the theory and development, it was very interesting, because it showed all we them, which were basically question of difference. There was not, as I insist again, because I think that some question that I was posed words indicating that when we them establish antagonism, no, we them we cannot exist. I mean, some say there is no, in order to have some kind of Belarus, we need to have other countries which are different, religion. So there is no, and that's what I think the social approach is so important. Identities are always relational. We don't have identities if it's not, other identities. Okay, so this is for me crucial. And of course the fact that those with them, and of many times, they don't normally are constructed in a political way, but they can become. And what has happened in Yugoslavia is precisely that. Serbian and Croat and Slovenian, they were of course different, but they were not constructed in terms of friend and enemy. And then in certain circumstances, after the death of Tito, when Milosevic tried to impose the Serbian supremacy, then those regions became constructed as a friend of an enemy. I think that is very important to understand that, and so this is why I think that you can understand that if you start from the point of view of dissociative. So again, this is the argument I would make. If you start on that, you can understand. So there is some better understanding of political life. But this is what I think political theories can do. Develop a theory that helps people understand. But they are not the one who should do, then you should do that. I think that, in fact, in my case, I've been very pleased to see how movement like Podemos in Spain, like La France Insoumise, have been appropriating those ideas that Alba developing, or that Ernesto and I were developing, and to analyze their situation, to understand them, to establish some politics, but it's to people, you produce, let's say for me, I can produce some theoretical framework, and then people need to appropriate that, examine the situation, and establish a strategy according to the situation. Just, okay, another last answer, because I realize that there are some question here concerning the distinction, the difference in the terrorist and I. Honestly, I don't think there is any fundamental difference. What happened is that after hegemonic socialist strategy, we developed, both of us in fact, developed some of the ideas in different directions. And I have always, in a sense, been more interested in, remember in my presentation I say I will distinguish the reflection on the political. In fact, the distinction, the political and politics, you could translate that in Heideggerian terms in the level of the ontological, which is the political, and the ontic, which is politics. I was always kind of more interested in developing the ontic level, the level of politics. Ernesto was more the metaphysician, the relation to developing the ontological level. So in fact, after we wrote the book together, it's not that we went into different directions theoretically, but we began to study different questions, developing the approach of hegemony in different contexts. And of course, for instance, obviously was more interested in Latin America, much more interested in Europe. So there is some differences in our work, but it is certainly not a point where there is a discrepancy. I don't think there is any discrepancy. For instance, in my book, For Left Populism, I think clearly I prefer to appropriate a lot of the analysis of Ernesto Populism activities on populist reason, and articulated that with my agonistic model. So I think that there was some differences which are more linked to the fact that the type of reflection, I was always more interested in Greek politics and understanding conjuncture, and Ernesto in elaborating more the theoretical aspect. So I don't think that there is, we can see any difference there. And by the way, something which I want to say, because somebody mentioned that, again, well, it was not surprising, but there have been many understanding about our work. And one of them, for instance, was, but that was used in a very malevolent way by some oppositor, because Ernesto is true, that was probably before hegemony, but the idea, of course, is there also an hegemony. Society does not exist. No? What he meant, of course, is that society does not exist as a theoretical object. But of course, after that, Margaret Thatcher declared that there is no such a thing of society. But she meant something completely different, completely different. And of course, I remember, what was his name? Marxist theoretician, who attacked Ernesto. You see, he's saying the same thing as Margaret Thatcher, and it's really bad faith, because the guy is completely stupid, which I don't think, because it was definitely bad faith to try to do it. But again, I want to insist, Ernesto did not mean at all the same thing as Margaret Thatcher. It's not a theoretical object that we can really study. That is something that can only be studied through a specific conjuncture. So that's, I think it's important to, I mean, there will be more thing to say, but I think we are already past 9 o'clock.
I wonder whether it's possible to conceptualize post-democratic condition as a shared condition, shared both by Western and East European societies. But maybe it's a question for our next meeting. Now we have to finalize this conversation. Thank you very much for rich discussion. And Chantal, thank you very much for insightful reflections.